Evening, everybody, and it's wonderful to see such a large crowd. I'm Fiona Gardner, Director of Heritage at Environment and Heritage Protection, and I would really like to welcome you all to this special event, Does Heritage Have a Future? Tonight's discussion is part of the monthly Out of the Port series presented by the State Library of Queensland in partnership with the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection. As always, we begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal people and the Yugara, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The Out of the Port series is now in its third year, and it aims to present new perspectives on Queensland's history and heritage and to challenge traditional views. The series has presented a diverse range of speakers and topics, ranging from Andrew Stafford's view of Brisbane's post-pig city to Queensland's historic shipwrecks, the history of Queensland's cookbooks, and the story behind one of our most prominent landmarks, the South East Freeway. See what happens tonight. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Queensland Heritage Council, and in particular Peter Coldrake, the Chair, for supporting tonight's event as part of the celebrations to mark the 20 years of the Queensland Heritage Act. I'd also like to thank Till's Wines, who generously supplied the wine that we had before. I'd also like to acknowledge some of the Heritage Council members who are here tonight, both past and present, and also the State Library, in particular Louise Denoon, Executive Manager of Queensland Memory, who's the great partner in the Out of the Port, Janet Prowse, the State Archivist, and Stephen Sheath, the President of the National Trust of Queensland. Tonight, the panellists are going to explore the concept of what is heritage, what is worth saving, and what might we value in the future. Following the panel discussion, there will be opportunity for audience questions. And can you please wait until we come with the microphone before asking your questions. As we are audio recording this talk for the State Library's website, as well as for Radio National's Big Ideas program, would you please identify yourself when asking a question? The final housekeeping, if you have to leave during the session, the exit is at the rear, and the toilets are located on level 2 and 3 near the auditorium doors. Please turn off the mobile phones, or at least put them on silent, but you're encouraged to tweet, and you can see that up there. So I'd like to introduce our facilitator for tonight's event, Dr. Kate Evans. Kate is a historian and broadcaster. She works for ABC Radio National's Books and Arts Daily and Books Plus programs. She has a PhD in history, and she has rarely met a plaque that she didn't like. Kate is going to find out what places would make our panellists throw themselves in front of the bulldozers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and hello and welcome again to this special event about the future of the past, or rather the future of heritage, the future of how the past is defined, identified, codified, celebrated, remembered, signpost, preserved, or, let's face it, argued about. And we're having this discussion on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Queensland Heritage Act. 20 years doesn't seem very long, to be honest, given the stretch of history and given how long these issues have been debated. And so here we are at the State Library of Queensland, as well as being part of a national discussion on big ideas on Radio National. And in talking about the wider context, I should say that the definitions and controlling forces around heritage are very complicated. There's world, Commonwealth, national and state heritage. On a formal level, there are different acts for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. And on a personal level, of course, there's cultural and ethnic heritage. There's the old box of photos under the bed. There's the button jar with its objects of memory balanced on top of a shelf. And there's that place in your mind where a kiss was stolen, or blood was spilled, where your life was changed, or where something very important was hidden away for good. And so tonight we're taking a fairly eclectic and encompassing view of what heritage is and why it matters. We're not sticking to the legislative terms, but hey, we're also not all going to agree. And so to discuss the future of heritage, to speculate on what you would or wouldn't chain yourself to, we're joined by empathic columnist Kathleen Noonan, memoirist and adventurous journalist Benjamin Law, collector of stories and broadcaster Richard Fidler, and feminist and writer Dale Spender. And welcome to all of you. And I think we should begin with the personal, and we'll become grander and grander, I think, as the evening goes on. So, Kathleen Noonan, you grew up in North Queensland, and I'm wondering which parts of that environment have ingrained themselves on you in terms of how you understand the past?
I grew up on a sugarcane farm, cattle and sugarcane, and so I'm very much a creature of that. I love sheds, old buildings, things that were purposeful and workmanlike. I love old pieces of equipment. There's not a shed with a rusty roof in Brisbane that I don't love. But I also grew up, all our neighbours were big Maltese and Italian families, and all my friends were. And so it's interesting because I didn't grow up with any stories of their past. And there were sort of these hidden stories. No, they were the sort of the first and second generation of migrant families, and I think it's indicative of that migrants come to a place and don't look back. The children all speak English, and you want to get ahead. You want to leave poverty behind. You're always aware that poverty is at your heels. And so I didn't hear any stories of sort of the migrant and the Italian families until recently. And I was talking to a great-grandmother in one of the families, and she said that she came out as a 17-year-old. She ended up having 13 children, and they came out, her husband was a cane cutter, and then he owned his own farm. They lived in a little hut, and she told me that they had their bed was Hessian sugar bag filled with the trash of the cane. And that wasn't unusual. That was pretty normal. Clearly at work they had 13 children. But these were hidden stories when I was a child. No one talked about that and talked about the poverty. And if you came from Malta, Malta was a rock with very impoverished soil. So when they landed in North Queensland, in fertile soil, they were hugely successful. And I think the other hidden stories that we weren't told and talked about as children were the stories of what were called the Kanaka families, or the South Sea Islander indentured workers was what they were called, but really they were sugar slaves. And they were stolen and brought to North Queensland. And a lot of my friends were children or grandchildren of the South Sea Islanders, but no one mentioned their stories. So I was always aware that there was, the youngest child in a big family, you're always aware of sort of there's something hidden, there's secrets going on. And I was very aware of that. And at Mackay, Rockhampton, most of those North Queensland regional towns, central and North Queensland towns, are going through a boom time at the moment with the coal industry. And I'm really aware that they're losing a lot. Booms are as bad for a town as busts in as far as losing heritage is concerned. So I guess that's where I come from when it comes to heritage.
Well, Benjamin Law, you're also a Queenslander from the Sunshine Coast. What is it about that place that resonates with you? Is it theme parks? Is it tourism? What does it say to you?
When my parents were splitting up when I turned 12 years old, there was an interesting sort of ad hoc arrangement between my mother and my father. And when I say arrangement, it was very, very sort of improvised. And they tried figuring out who would take us and when, and it was decided that my father would take us every second weekend to hang out. And of course, my father had never really hung out with the kids before, so he was a complete loss as to what to do, and he really needed suggestions. Now, we grew up on the Sunshine Coast, and about an hour and a half north of Brisbane. And the Sunshine Coast is probably most well known for its beaches. And we were a Chinese-Australian family, 2 parents, 5 kids. The beach terrified us. We aren't very good swimmers. My mum hates sand, just generally just hates sand. My father just assumed we'd all drowned. He thought that thongs split the toes unnaturally, so we weren't beach bums. The thing that, probably the other thing that the Sunshine Coast is known for, but it's not something that I advertise quite proudly necessarily, is their theme parks. And though the Gold Coast is very well known for its theme parks and people travel all over the country to come to Gold Coast theme parks, the Sunshine Coast theme parks are a little bit hokey, but we went to all of them because my dad needed some easy options. So to give you a sample, there were a lot of big things. There was a big cow, there was a big shell, there was a big bottle with a slippery slide going around it. There was the big pineapple, of course. There was a water slide park. I won't name it by name in case there are legal ramifications, but it was closed down because of Legionnaire's disease. There are all sorts of weird things going on as well. Like there are sort of hodgepodge theme parks where it's like this has a ride and Australian fauna and all of this other stuff like show bags tacked onto it just because. And so we'd go to all of these theme parks. So they're very much a part of my growing up experience, growing up in a way where you look back on it and you look back on it with half affection and half just complete cringe at all of what it represents as well. So when it comes to the idea of preservation and the idea of these places within my imagination or within the public imagination, I mean, look, my family comes from a rich history of slightly obsessive-compulsive hoarders. So when I look at things to preserve or to keep, part of it is deep down inside myself, instinctively on an animal level. I want to hold on to everything. I don't want anything to change. And the other more practical part of me wants to demolish everything out of existence because I just find it completely horrible and have miserable connotations with it as well. That's when it comes to theme parks, at least.
Now, Richard Fidler, you weren't born in Queensland, so I'd like to concentrate on where you are now. In terms of valuing material culture, tell us about Brisbane architecture and suburbia. I mean, what does that mean to you?
Well, just as a bit of an out to begin with, to preface this, I only moved here about 7 years ago. And when I was a teenager, I read the biography of Douglas MacArthur called American Caesar by William Manchester. It's an amazing book, and some of the most interesting and vivid descriptions in it are of wartime Brisbane, when MacArthur was stationed at Lennon's Hotel across the river here and had his office in the MLC building, I think it is, which is now the MacArthur Museum in the CBD. And when I moved here, I thought, look, I'd be really interested with my son, who's also really interested in history, to take him around to some of these places and show evidence of Brisbane's amazing wartime history. And the more I know about it, the more kind of enthralling it is what happened here, what a wild and crazy place this town was during those years. And there's almost none of it. There's so little of it. It's been concreted over, it's been built over. There's the little MacArthur Museum, which is really lovely and kind of precious. And there's really not much that's left of Brisbane's history at that time. So I started doing an afternoons program here, and part of that was to do a regular segment on local history, because a lot of people who live in South East Queensland are like me, they're blow-ins, and may not have a strong sense of the extraordinary history this city in particular has. And so I wanted to hear from older listeners on a theme to talk about some of the things that were a big part of Brisbane in years gone by that are now gone and gone for good. Oh, we had the most achingly emotional calls from people who have beautiful memories of what it was like to see Christmas department store displays in the department stores in Fortitude Valley, or to go on some of the river cruises that used to be there and were such a big part of enjoying a weekend along the Brisbane River, and the beaches that used to be along the Brisbane River as well. There were so many facets of life which have gone and gone forever in this life, and the effect it had, the real feeling and emotion you could hear in people's voices was really quite profound. A couple of years ago on my Conversations program, I had a guest who was an American. His father was actually one of MacArthur's aides-de-camp during the war years, and he said, I want to go and see that side of Brisbane. I want to see a bit of what old Brisbane was like. And I said, look, you might as well just stay away from the CBD, sadly. You might as well just... If you want to see something that's interesting and original of Brisbane, you have to see its suburbs. The suburbs are full of these houses which we now venerate, full of Queenslanders and modernist homes, which were built by a whole other generation when Brisbane was a poor city. And it was hot, there was no air conditioning. And they built houses that were original and beautiful and practical and modest and sociable, that worked. and are really quite unique. And that's true, of course. The Queenslander was taken throughout all of Queensland. I live in the Gap, which is 15 minutes from the CBD in Brisbane, which is got a few of those kind of houses, but more of those amazing 50s modernist houses, which are just delightful, these 50s modernist bungalows, which are light and airy and spacious and are fantastic. And when my friends in Sydney ask me, what's this place, what's the suburb you're living in like? And I say, it's like Brady Bunch land. It's full of houses that are designed by Mike Brady. And they're lovely, they're beautiful. I feel such a strong attachment to those houses. But as for the CBD, I don't have bulldozer fantasies where I want to chain myself to any buildings in the CBD. I have wrecking ball fantasies. I think the CBD has been ruined. Much of it should go, and we should start again from first principles.
So already, I mean, we're not 10 minutes in and we've got stories about regional industrial heritage, about tourism, about architecture, about suburbia, and that's calling on 3 personal stories and a sense of what the past means. And Dale Spender, in talking to you about the impact, your sense of heritage, I guess I had a sense of defining you in a different way. And so rather than your personal story in terms of an international political movement and to see where that might take us in terms of heritage. So as a feminist living now in Brisbane, what resonates for you in terms of heritage and our relationship to the past?
Well, my sense of heritage as a woman is pretty well about loss. And I've spent most of my life doing research on lost women, lost voices, lost statues, lost banners, you name it. That's what's happened to women's history. And just recently, with our Prime Minister's venture into polemics about misogyny, I was thinking about the loss of women's language. And I don't know how many people reflect on this, but the dictionary that is the basis of the English language was a brilliant feat by Samuel Johnson in 1755. And what he did is he got all these print sources and he actually used them to work out what the meanings of words were. They were all male sources, which I don't think anybody has quite registered. And the view that you get of a dictionary is very much male words. I mean, a woman would not, for example, have ever thought of the concept of an illegitimate child. She's unlikely to give birth and ask, is it mine? But that was that's where the male perspective comes. It also helps to explain why there are 220 words for promiscuous women and almost none for promiscuous men. So the loss of language is in itself quite significant. And of course the real piece de resistance is 1851 in the House of Commons in England, when a group of exclusively male politicians passed the act to make man stand for woman. Now, it's a bit like saying we will legislate for dog to stand for cat, but that's beside the point. And their grounds were that man was a more comprehensive category than women. So I had come from that background of language and literature. And, one of the things I did when I lived in London, I got tired of being told about the fathers of the novel and never being told about the mothers of the novel. And I was told that the first great woman novelist was Jane Austen. And I went to the London Library, and it was 2 years of my life. There was no list at that time of women novelists in the English language, by the way. So that's another loss, that you've got no heritage that you have. For 2 years, I took off the shelves of the London Library any book that I thought might have been written by a woman. That included hundreds and hundreds of anonymous, by the way. And I actually went through them and worked out whether the likelihood was that it was written by a woman. I got all the women's there. I made a list of the women's novelists. And I found 100 best-selling women's novelists before Jane Austen. Among them was a woman called Eliza Haywood, who wrote The History of Betsy Thoughtless in 1751, which was long before a woman wrote a novel, I was told on many occasions in academic institutions. And the history of Betsy Thoughtless discussed at great length the issues of abortion, and the one that really intrigued me was whether a woman was justified in leaving a husband on the grounds of the fact that he was boring. And she decided... 1751, she decided she was justified in leaving, and I thought, oh my God, she'll be run over by a bus. But no, in 1751, she went on to have the most wonderful life that you can imagine after being divorced. She first of all married Mr. Thoughtless, the history of Betsy Thoughtless, but she ended up marrying Mr. Truegood, and she lived happily ever after. But when I came back to Australia after nearly 15 years in England, and I started looking around at Australian novelists, and I found one called Rosa Praed, who was born in 1855 on the Gold Coast in a tent in the most appalling circumstances you can imagine, who lived there until she was 17, whose playmates were Indigenous kids. She learnt Indigenous language, she learnt Indigenous law. Her mother died under horrible circumstances. In 1867, her father was elected as he became the first Postmaster General of Queensland, and he sat in the first Parliament, and they came to live in Kangaroo Point, where I live today. And she rowed across, she was her father's hostess, and she rowed across the water regularly. I can't find out where she lived, but, talk about heritage and lost women's heritage. This intrigues me enormously. At the age of 25, her father remarried and told her that she had 6 months in which to find a husband, and then she wouldn't have a home. She married very badly, and her husband took her to live on Fraser Island, and much of what we know about the history of Fraser Island was written by her. Their enterprise went bankrupt. They went to London, and by 1880, Rosa Praed was one of the most celebrated novelists in England. She wrote 40 novels. She was one of the best-selling novels in the British Empire at the time. Her first novel was called Policy and Passion, and it was about a young woman who was married to the Premier of Leichardt's Land, which was Queensland, and he was a convict. He had been a convict and became the Premier, and he was blackmailed. And so the first novel, Policy and Passion, and it's about corruption in Queensland politics, which you wouldn't believe. And one of the issues, because she, on area, rose across to listen to the sittings in the House, and it's about where the railway line was going to go. And evidently it was going to go like this all up Queensland, depending on who paid for it to stop at their station. So that was that. But Rosa Praed then went on, she wrote 40 novels. She was a friend of Oscar Wilde. She was the doyen of the literary scene in London. She wrote a novel called The Bond of Wedlock, which made such an impression that it was dramatised on the West End and became one of the most... It was like The Mousetrap, and it was about whether a woman was entitled to leave her husband if he hit her. And the answer in that case was no, that you couldn't get a divorce, that domestic violence was not sufficient grounds. Boring was, clearly, a couple of 100 years before. I'm not sure of the value system there. But I walk round Kangaroo Point on many an occasion and wonder, was she here? Did she row over there? Where was the house sitting at the time she wrote these wonderful books? So for me, it's about loss and recovery. She's written lots of other novels. I won't go into them all. But I think this is my heritage. And what I'd like to see is it recovered. And I think in digital terms, there's lots of things that you actually can do. That was my long answer. I warned. The rest will be short.
But also a powerful reminder of the way in which heritage is not just about either material culture or heritage places. It can be much more amorphous than that. And also, given that we are in the State Library, of course, it can be about document-based heritage. But Kathleen, you wrote about this project and you wrote about heritage in your column on the weekend. and you were specifically asking your readers to respond to you about their sense of heritage and place and so on in Queensland. So what did they tell you? What was mattering to people?
Every time you write about heritage or a heritage issue, and usually it's about saving something in Brisbane, you get hundreds of emails. You are always shocked when it's about something specific that there's an ignorance about our city. You know, you'll tell people we're about to lose something and they'll say, really, I didn't know that, I didn't know that place. I'm astounded by that from someone who doesn't come from Brisbane. They felt that way about Yungabar under the Story Bridge. People just said, I've never knew anything about that building at all, never saw it, never went under there. So that's the first thing. I'm always astounded by how much people don't know about their city. The second thing was, there was a couple of disappointing emails, I have to say. There was a couple of readers who said, look, what does it matter? We're going to be filming it all, it's all going to be virtual, you'll be able to walk 3D through any place, any site, any building. We don't need the real thing, we're just going to have virtual. And so what does it matter? I'm hoping they were tongue-in-cheek. I'm going to have to send them a very terse email in reply, I have to say, and put them on the right track. The other readers were talking about specific things like the Valley Rattler, the train that goes to Gympie, the steam train, one of the few left in Queensland, and they haven't got funding under the last since the government's come in, and they've had a problem. They need about $1 million for their infrastructure, and they can't get the funding. And they were talking about the loss of skills to be able to drive the steam trains. They had trained up a factory fitter to be able to work on those sort of pieces of equipment. So that's really, is in that larger world of artisans and stonemasons and the loss of skills to keep those sort of things, going. Most people who emailed most of the readers see heritage as buildings and sites, definitely, and they also. There's often a sense of hopelessness. What can we do? It's okay if you can give them a deadline to send submissions to try and stop something, but there's a sense of what can we do against government. And I believe you've really got to mobilise. You've really got to think people who are interested in history are usually really nice, and they're very polite. And they think, if I send a very angry letter to the minister, he'll see the folly of his ways, and he'll reverse that decision. And it doesn't happen that way. And governments and corporations play really dirty. And I find people who work in a historical, the heritage areas are just too nice for them. And you've got to get mean, and you've got to be like the 23-year-old who did that online campaign against Alan Jones. You've got to think like that. You've got to hit them where it hurts, and you've got to think about, who do I target to stop this happening? And I think the digital world holds some really great answers for saving heritage. But yes, lots of very nice readers.
Well, perhaps one way to talk about this then is to use a case study. And Benjamin Law, I know that you've got one that you've thought long and hard about, and that's Stefan's Needle.
Oh my God. Okay, so Stefan's Needle, let's go back to 1988 when Brisbane was in the throes of World Expo, and I was very excited about this. I was 6 years old and would make regular trips to what's now South Bank. And Brisbane was alive, and it felt like the whole world was on our doorstep, and every pavilion was another country, and you had your little passbook, and you had your little platypus backpack and cap, and it was all very, very exciting. And of course, one of the monuments that was a part of World Expo 88 that year was this huge metal rod, for want of a better word. It's a giant phallus. And what was supposed to happen after World Expo 88 was that this giant metal structure was supposed to be shipped over to Tokyo for their Disney World, their Disneyland over there, rather. And Stefan, who we all know in Queensland as a very much-loved hairdresser and entrepreneur, he has speedboats as well, he was so in love with this structure and so didn't want to see it gone that he acquired it, and he placed it where it is now in South Brisbane near Stefan's headquarters, and he made the very tip of this this metal structure a rainbow, which is his logo, and inadvertently, I guess, made it into a beacon of gay pride in the city as well. And so it's always been this thing, and I remembered when I would either visit Brisbane, and when I first moved to Brisbane in the late 90s, that I lived in South Brisbane, in West End specifically, for a very long time, and our view was on the top of Highgate Hill, and you'd look out onto the skyline. It was so beautiful, and there'd just be this strange this neon rainbow in the middle of the sky. And we all talked about it disparagingly. Stefan's Needle, what even is it? It looks so ugly. It's so weird that this is a part of our skyline, that it's so recognisable. It's so shameful in a way. But then I remember when I was working at a bookshop in West End, Avid Reader Bookshop, and it was 2006, and there was a huge storm going on that day, and there were blackouts in certain places, and there were electrical faults going around in certain structures, and one of the structures that had an electrical fault was Stefan's Needle. And we looked out and it was on fire. And we all sort of put our hand to our mouths and we said to each other, "This is our 9/11." And part of us we were joking about it, like it was so funny seeing Stefan's Needle on fire. But there was another part as well, when you didn't see that rainbow in the skyline anymore. It was a very sad sort of omission. And then, of course, when Stefan brought it back and he put the rainbow back up there, it was quite funny the way people talk about it now. Remember when Stefan's Needle caught on fire? And now it's got that little story that we all refer back to. It's kitsch, but I think Brisbane always has that slight element of kitsch that we despise and yet love at the same time.
So, Richard, given the wrecking ball fantasy, where does something like this, where does the tacky and the tawdry and the, odd sit in with your sense of what you do with the wrecking ball or not?
Well, I haven't shared Ben's fondness for Stefan's Needle, but not until now, until I realised the whole point of that rainbow up there on the needle was eventually turned West End into a hipster suburb by advertising it as being gay-friendly. I hadn't thought of that until this point in time, but now I understand that. I see a lot of stuff that's been knocked up in Brisbane as a sense of embarrassment over Brisbane's poverty-stricken past. This was a really poor city. It was hit really hard by the Depression of the 1890s and by the 1930s as well. And I sometimes suspect there's an element of... by the time the 60s, 70s, 80s came around, there was an element of shame about that. This is when we were poor. Now we're a bit more cashed up from mining, so we can afford to bring Jamie Dury and the backyard blitz people in and knock up the Myer Centre. Things like that kind of knocked up thing like the Myer Centre are things that really bother me about Brisbane. The arrogance of a building like that sort of is plonked there like a giant fat ass along Elizabeth Street, which has no kind of access to it at all. It forces pedestrians to go up and around it, so there's access to the car park. It's got, as a facade, it's got that salmon pink sort of side wall there with these kind of fake little arches there that are this tawdry and pathetic attempt at decoration. And you've got the car park at the front of the transit centre at Roma Street, which is possibly the largest structure in the southern hemisphere constructed entirely out of pebblecrete. The police station, the police headquarters across the road, which has got a funny little hat on top of it as well. These are really ugly buildings that were sort of put up to make Brisbane look plausible, to sort of scrub over Brisbane's poor past. And of course, doing so got rid of a whole lot of stuff that was truly beautiful, and it makes me feel terribly sad. There are things like City Hall in Brisbane, which I think are just fantastic. I love City Hall. I think it's a very beautiful building, and kind of nutty as well. That Greco-Roman kind of facade at the front there, and with the columns, and then it's sort of a bit like the Albert Hall inside, and in front of it is a row of palm trees, and it's kind of crazy and lovely. So what do? In order to gussy that up, we roll out the King George Square development, which to me looks like, which is something that I can't find anyone in the Brisbane City Council who wants to take ownership of that. Once it was done, they all stepped away and went, "Oh yeah, it didn't quite pan out, did it, really?" And it really looks like that moment in The Simpsons when Marge Simpson's been arrested and Bart's in charge of the housework, and his solution is to put every bit of junk under the living room rug. That's what King George Square looks like at the moment. Sort of rolling bumps where you get entrance into the King George bus station there. It's sort of put there and it's all kind of a bit sad and forlorn. So I see this kind of cringy attempt at gussying up the city that's happened in the last 30 years or so. And most of it's just awful. It's terrible and sad, and it looks embarrassed about the kind of place Brisbane is. And Brisbane's an amazing place. Its climate is extraordinary. We live in this place where the weather inspires fear in people like me who haven't lived here for very long all the time. It's so big, it's so widescreen, and so little of the architecture of our city seems to even acknowledge that. And consequently, we have a CBD that really looks like a whole lot of other places. It could be Stuttgart, it could be Houston, it could be Calgary, it could be, 20 different anonymous, bland cities with that same international style of architecture. Now, you do see glorious exceptions to it, and a lot of them are dotted around here in Southbank. The building we're in, I think, is one of the most beautiful buildings in Australia, the State Library. I want to see a new kind of modern Queensland form of architecture that embraces the climate, that offers shade, that offers breezeways, that suits the climate, that is a kind of a modern expression of the place we live in and speaks of the place. I want to see much more of that rather than the bland international pap that's been put up there. Sorry, am I beating around the bush too much here with this? I wonder if I'm making myself clear about this. I don't know.
Well, there are so many different ways and different debates about how that might happen, and ways in which either spaces, places, or other forms of storytelling might address those gaps and those questions and the hidden spaces and so on. And so I'm wondering, just to bring Dale back into the discussion, where things like quotas fit in, where if we need to be formal in some way about addressing those gaps and those hidden parts of the stories. Is that what does it, or do we need to be more adventurous than that?
Well, I believe in quotas. 50% male. I think that would be ideal. 50% female principals on boys' schools. 50% male. I think quotas could be an admirable target for women to achieve in terms of equality. I mean, that's a bit facetious, but the way quotas are used at times, if you say 50% of women and people make some sort of comment about that means you get, ineffectual people or incompetent people and they're there just because they're women. Well, there are a lot of blooming men that are there because they're men. You have to rethink some of these things. But coming back to your notion about King George Square, I suddenly realised this afternoon, I was thinking quotas, how many monuments are there for women? I mean, seriously, how many do you know? And if they are, they're stylised things of, Britannia or something like that, but actually commemorating achievements by women, there are very, very few. But Emma Miller was one of them. And I contacted Louise this afternoon and said, is Emma Miller still in King George Square? Because that's where I saw her a long time ago, but I don't remember seeing her recently. And Louise said, oh yeah, she's still around, but she's been moved to the side a bit. And I thought, women's history, there you are, mainstream, middle of the square, and then bit by bit, off to the side, round the back, in the basement. It's absolutely planned. Now, one of the things I know about is the cliffs, the Kangaroo Point cliffs. And I don't know how many people here might know that those cliffs were quarried by convict women. And one of the things that I'd like to see would be a sort of light show along there of all those women quarrying those cliffs that no one could ever ignore and it wouldn't go away. That would be one of my quotas, that we could, with the digital age, make much more of what women's achievements are. We could compensate for some of the loss. I know you said that about digital and, it's all be on virtual reality, etc. But this is my dear, darling friend who, when I said we've got to get rid of the books to make room for the widgets, said, you can't get the books.
Give them to me, I'll keep the books.
You couldn't manage them. I think we've got lots of opportunities to recreate some of our heritage in lots of ways. I mean, maybe we could even have some sort of virtual reality of what Brisbane might have looked like. I mean, like you, I came back, my partner, you typical feminist, follow a man, my partner came back to Queensland, and we had lived in Kings Road, Chelsea for 15 years, and I ended up in St Lucia without a pram. I was an absolute eyesore in that I couldn't, everybody around me had a pram and all I wanted was a coffee shop, and I didn't think I'd stay here very long. And here I am, 20 years later, and I would choose to live in Brisbane if I'm living in Australia. I think it's a beautiful city that, like you, I think it's had lots of its heritage obliterated, but I also think there's an opportunity to recreate some of that in lots of ways, and to actually imaginatively work out what was there and how we could alert people to what, digital's about. There are layers behind layers behind layers. We could start thinking about the layers behind things and not just the surface of things. I'm a digital diva, by the way, and a feminist.
But even as a digital diva, you were talking about celebrating things. But if we're talking about heritage and history, it's not all celebratory, is it? And no. Kathleen, as people have been talking to you about these stories, and we've talked about it before as well, there are really tough stories out there too that we need to address. Institutional stories, stories of loss, stories of domestic violence, stories of homes for people with disabilities. Where do they fit into this story?
I think when a family or a city or a nation, it shows great maturity when you can not cringe away from the really ugly stories and the uncomfortable stories. I remember being in someone's home when there was a removalist working there, and we were having afternoon tea. There was cake on the table, and I said, "Help yourself." And he snatched a bit and stood behind a wall to eat it, so the other men couldn't see him. It was quite childlike, quite furtive. And I said, "Oh, you must come from a big family or went to boarding school," because I came from a big family, went to boarding school, and that's how you got cake. And he said, "No, I was in an orphanage. I was taken from my mother, who was deemed to be mentally ill, and I went to Nearcol. I don't know if many people know about Nearcol, outside Rockhampton. Children were taken there and starved and beaten and abused. They certainly weren't loved and taken care of." And some of those stories have come out with things like the Ford inquiry. But I remember later on I contacted this guy, this is going back about 15 years, and he said, on my file that I got from the government, it said that I was given chemotherapy and these other drugs. And he said, I was never sick, I didn't have cancer, why was I given these drugs? And at the time I didn't really explore that with him. But in recent years I've heard other stories of people who said they were experimented on in Nearcol. They were given vaccines before they were released on the public. They were given cancer drugs. So to me, they're hidden stories which we haven't really addressed. And big institutions like churches and governments, they say, yes, we want to acknowledge your story and then we want it to be in the past. But, you've got to hear the ugliness of the stories, and those stories have to go on into the future. They've got to be told because they're part of who we are.
Can I just say, I think celebrating heritage is a bad idea. I think it inevitably leads to kitsch. Milan Kundera's famous book, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, was about this ongoing struggle. This is something I think that Dale was touching on and got me thinking, hearing what you were saying about the author, who we've completely forgotten, clearly. What a struggle it was in Czechoslovakia during the communist years there, to remember things that the regime didn't want people to remember, and the struggle that it was to secretly and furtively make sure things were remembered that needed to be remembered and not to be officially forgotten. And it seems to have happened here without any need for that kind of totalitarianism in Queensland. And that's what heritage is, I think. It's a struggle to remember, not to celebrate. I mean, it's too complex to go hooray at that. But these are things that need to be remembered, the things that Dale's talking about. I didn't know there were women convicts that quarried that. Yeah, my mind is seriously being blown, but hear you say that. I'm dying to find out what that story is. There are great stories, and stories hold many, many, many things in them, and part of it are things to feel like things you want to celebrate, other things that you want to recoil in horror from, but they're kind of a bundle of a whole lot of different emotions. But when you sort of want to do celebration thing. You get caught up with that kind of really creepy Queensland exceptionalism sometimes, which holds that people instantly become more virtuous once they cross the border and become better at football, across the Tweed, that kind of thing, which, well, whatever. But I think the idea is to remember, isn't it? That's what we're talking about. Isn't that the point of heritage?
Well, and to be fair, when you actually look at the things that are on the heritage list, there are extraordinary stories. I mean, like the lazaret at Peel Island, where people with leprosy were taken, and then in 1940 all the Aboriginal inmates were sent up to Phantom Island, which I think is now on the Heritage Register as well. Even given that so much of that heritage has also been about sites of tourism, when you head from Brisbane to North Stradbroke Island and you land at Dunwich, the whole town of Dunwich was a benevolent asylum with 1,000 people there in 1900. And I know that's recognised by the Heritage Act, but I guess the next question is how much it's recognised on a public and popular level, and how much, I guess for those of us who are in the media, how much that storytelling or other inventive ways of dealing with that heritage might be embedded into those stories, so that we don't see the places as objects but as containers for stories in all sorts of ways. But I guess one of the other things that's a sort of tricky one there is who owns those stories and what happens if they become mainstream. So things like the history of gay Brisbane or gay Queensland, does it harm that history if it is made sort of popular in a simple way?
I don't think anyone, including a lot of especially young gay people, and this is including myself until recently, know really the story of gay Queensland. And I think partly that's because I'm young, but also partly because it's not told, let alone popularised. And it wasn't until, we're talking about, the 20th anniversary of this act. Well, a few years ago it was the 20th anniversary of the decriminalisation of homosexual acts in Queensland. So for Q Weekend I wrote a story where I profiled different people, prominent gay, lesbian, queer activists during that time, and what was actually going on to push for that legal reform. And one of the people I interviewed was a gentleman named Nick, and Nick was one of the, I forget the exact name of the organisation now, but he was one of the founding people who organised a committee, a group, to actively push for legislative change when it came to this specific law. And as I was talking to him about this history, I knew that something would have had to have happened at some stage for this law to have been changed, but the intense political manoeuvring that was going on was completely new to me, who they had to convince and what sort of discussions were taking place. And beyond that conversation as well were where these meetings were taking place or where people would socialise. They're not places that I necessarily know of. And back then, of course, because it was a criminalised community, it had to be far more underground as well. I recently wrote a book where, for one of the chapters, I went to India, because India is the latest country in the world to have decriminalised homosexuality there through the Delhi High Court. And that was only a few years ago. But their story is quite fascinating, because it was an alliance between so many different people in so many different parts of the country that allowed that to happen. And similarly in Queensland, in Brisbane specifically, this was political manoeuvring going on at different people's places at very particular times. It was like, when I was hearing these stories, it was like, what I imagine the screenwriter for Milk had to do when he was going back and contacting all these people to actually put this puzzle together. And I didn't necessarily get all the pieces, but it was completely new. And I don't think we really have too many public ways of recognising that. I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that the struggle for queer rights isn't over by any means. So there are still fights we have to look forward towards, and I think especially for young people, it can be hard to necessarily engage with the past, especially in a community where it's so fragmented by age as well.
And I was just thinking, Richard, when you're talking about your interest in the World War II history of Brisbane, of course that was a history that included soldiers and sailors dancing cheek to cheek. But it's not as easy to access. And, would that be part of the MacArthur Museum or not?
Absolutely. And more than that, my understanding is, and I could be wrong about this, but the stories I've heard indicate that this whole part of Brisbane was kind of like the Casbah of Australia, essentially, during those war years. African-American soldiers were not allowed into the CBD. I'm right in thinking that, so there was a kind of boundary drawn. So I hear stories of like nightclubs that were set up here in South Brisbane, jazz nightclubs. I don't know how true that is, but I've heard some reports. You probably know much more about this than I do, Kate. But it's kind of cool to walk down and imagine all this happening, and imagine what it's like for Brisbane girls, and the men are off at war. They're here. They're teenagers. They dress up, and they're dancing with an African American in a nightclub in Brisbane. Man, I mean, that's stories that come from that are amazing. Painting seams, seams, pantyhose seams down their legs with pencils and that kind of thing. Those kinds of stories ought to be the social histories, the culture that kind of exploded here when the city, double, triple, quadrupled in size, when it was the kind of absolute the general headquarters for the prosecution of the war in the Pacific for some years as it was.
And I know that here in the State Library there are some remarkable collections of papers from one woman. I read the collection of her papers, for example, and she was a stripper who worked in World War II in the nightclubs in Brisbane, and that's a part of the story that, some of those buildings and those theatres are still there and others have disappeared. But in celebrating those lost buildings and those lost places, I want her story too. I want to know about and there are pictures here in the State Library of her posing on various plinths, and she was one of the nudie cuties in the 1940s, and they're fantastic stories. But I should say too that we're on Big Ideas on Radio National. I'm going to start that again. I should say that we're on Big Ideas on ABC RN. I'm Kate Evans, and we're talking the future of heritage with journalists Kathleen Noonan and Benjamin Law, broadcaster Richard Fidler, and feminist and writer Dale Spender. I like that idea of having to address what's missing, what's absent, those places that have been knocked down or have disappeared or where there are only traces left. How do we reanimate them? Dale, you mentioned the digital possibilities. Are there other ways of reanimating the places that have disappeared, the ones that can never be memorialised in a conventional way? What do we do?
I don't think heritage is necessarily material. I'd call myself a knowledge feminist. My motto for 50 years of my life has been don't cry, do research. And I confronted the notion that, when I was growing up, and my mother said to me in exasperation one day, "You tell me who you want to be like and I'll help you." And I said, "Well, I don't want to be like you." That was all your friends. That was the starting point. And then we went through everybody we knew, and there was nobody that I wanted to be like. I didn't know anybody who lived a life like I have lived. I didn't know anyone. I knew that you could be a school teacher, a nurse, a secretary or a hairdresser. And I said to Mum, I think I probably need to be a hairdresser because all the hairdressers I know are their own bosses and that everyone else works for a man. I'd at least worked that out. But she said I couldn't be a hairdresser, I had to stay on at school. So then we went to literature and we went to people like, Anna Karenina, dead. Emma Woodhouse, married Mr. Knightley, lived happily ever after, hoax. All of these sorts of things. And my mother finally turned to me and said, "What you want doesn't exist." And I was 14 years of age. There was not a single role model that she could point me to in my life. And I certainly didn't know at 14, but by the time I was about 25 and the women's movement had started, I started to think about, is it true that women have been on this earth all this time and we've never done anything important unless we were a bloody queen or something like that, the Queen Victoria or Queen Catherine or something? Have we never done anything at all? And if we haven't done anything, does it mean we have to start now? But what if we have done wonderful things and I don't know about them? And one of the things I decided to do was to write a history of women's ideas. And I went along to my publisher, Routledge in London, and said to Norman Franklin, who was the publisher, terribly, terribly proper, I don't know how ever he published me, and who said to me, "Book of women ideas, be very small, Dale." It's 800 pages. But it didn't, and it's all these women who achieved all these wonderful things. Now, I know about that, and it changed my life. You know, and I stopped saying things like, behind every great man there's a woman. I'd say, you know, behind every great man there's, you know, someone who's appropriated the resources of a woman and used them to his own ends, etc., etc. I also know that once you understand some of women's history and their heritage and the stories, and I think women's history, you see, and women's lives in lots of ways, it's about so much silence. I mean, I just look at domestic violence even, and it's still so much silence, that things that can't be mentioned, things that can't be talked about, that are everyday realities. And I think that we have to sort of break that silence, come out and say, it's not necessarily to celebrate, but it releases things and you understand. You know, there have been so many fantastic, wonderful women who've done such marvellous things, but have ended up like Emma Miller, you know, off the stage and round the corner and down the basement. And they've got flooded. So, the end. Very difficult to do those things. So I'm not all that keen on the buildings, though I do think one that appeals to me immensely, this is very naughty, you might have to cut this out, is what was once the Grand Temple of the Masonic Lodge in Washington. It's now the Women's History Museum. Now I can't think of anything more appropriate for a building than the Women's History Museum, and it was a beautiful, beautiful building. So I'd go for that one as women's heritage. But a lot of the things I think are intangible and change the way you view the world. And women do grow up still with so few role models, but at least there are a few more than there were. You know, we do have a woman Prime Minister who uses the word misogyny correctly.
But Kathleen, there are some aspects of the world certainly that are changing for us and for our children. So the other question about heritage is how we collect, preserve, deal with the contemporary world and how we deal with it into the future. For you, is that about everyday life? Is it for sort of daily lived experience or the sort of grand sense of the state or the nation? What is it that we need to be dealing with now?
I couldn't legislate or even begin to comment on something like that. I think heritage and a sense of origins and achievements and some pride, even in things that have gone wrong, enhances your life and gives you a generosity of spirit that you don't have without a heritage. If it's taken away from you, if you don't have something to refer to, there's a sense, I mean, I still have a sense of loss about my past, no matter how many books I write and how much research I do. There's always a sense of something missing and stories not told. But I think if anybody tried to specify what you should know and what you shouldn't know, I mean, hardly anyone would ever end up with the diet that I've had of different women, and the ones that I think are fantastic and the ones that I'm not all that keen on. I think it's very difficult to specify anything. I think you make the most available of what you can with the least value judgments, as long as it's 50% women.
And I think we're reaching the point where we'll be turning to questions from the floor in a minute, but I guess I'm just wondering briefly from the rest of the panel, if this is leaving you feeling optimistic about our engagement with the past and with what we might be moving into the future with, or still ready for that wrecking ball?
Is that to me?
Oh no, that's to Kathleen or Richard or Benjamin.
I think Brisbaneites in particular have seen a lot destroyed, and we've realised that if you sit on the sidelines, things go overnight. So I think there's that sense of that you need to mobilise when you feel strongly about something. You need to think to yourself, I would chain myself to that building, I would chain myself to that site so it doesn't get destroyed. And I feel that way about a building like the Moreton Rubber building at the Gabba. She's a beautiful old building over there, and the Cantilever Stadium has grown over her. She fronts Logan Road and Vulture Street, and it's grown over her like this sort of 6-foot-tall hulking grandson, and she's the little grandma. And she's a fabulous old building, and she hasn't been overdeveloped, which is another thing we do in Brisbane. We take heritage buildings and we renovate them and shine them up till they're just perfect. And I don't think old buildings should be just perfect. So she's got this sort of creamy blue peeling paint with these sort of crazy old masonry balls on top. And that was a hotspot, a commercial hotspot in the Gabba Five Ways when she was built in the 1890s. But all that time she's remained something that was used by business. And today she's got a very interesting owner who will only sort of have tenants that he likes, whether you come to him with money or not. So he's got a very eclectic group of tenants who are very loyal to the building. And when you go downstairs into the cellar, because the Gabba Five Ways, that area was like a very ancient waterway where lots of Indigenous tribes came because it was rich with food. So you go down into the cellars of these buildings and they're cold as pewter. And you can touch these huge sort of beams down there. And to me, they're about our links with land as much as our links with buildings. So I'm optimistic that we've got a sense of what we've lost. And you know, we're going to fight really hard in the future.
I'm not optimistic at all, I'm afraid. I'm not at all. I think an interesting example to look at is to look at the cities that directly to the south of us, Sydney and Melbourne, and the different approaches they've taken. Sydney's been largely disastrous, I think, and we seem to be going down that Sydney road. Melbourne, on the other hand, went through an awful economic collapse at the beginning of the 1990s. I was there, I was living in there at the time. And something happened then. There was a new government with a strong planning minister, with a kind of sense of aesthetic and a sense that perhaps the city government, the Melbourne City Council also had an idea that the whole standard of the city needed to lift. I don't know if you remember what Melbourne CBD was like 25 years ago. It was an awful place. It was perhaps the ugliest CBD in Australia. But careful planning and an interesting approach to heritage, which was to not just sort of, you know, over-tidy it up like you're saying, Kathleen, which I think is quite right, but to build other things around it that talk to it and interface with it in new ways and play around with it, have turned Melbourne into a wholly different city. Part of that too was attracting residents into the CBD, which then brought local 24-hour businesses. It's transformed the place. Melbourne's such a pleasure to walk through now. It's an absolute joy. In Brisbane, well, you know, we had the Regent Theatre. There was a strong campaign by a lot of people to save it, and good on them for trying that. But in the end, there was kind of, well, the powers that be went, well, look, it's going to have to be turned into a corporate something. And that's pretty much what happened. Nothing was really done to try and preserve that. And the kind of approach that we've got at the moment is a kind of tepid, well, maybe we could have some Melbourne laneways, maybe, with an upward inflection at the end of that voice. That's where we are now, I think. There's not the environment which places talented, young, innovative architects and designers in and around the CBD to sustain and create a new urban environment, which is what's definitely required.
A new urban environment, Benjamin, with maybe flaming Stephen's needles all through it?
That's right, just flames and rainbows everywhere. Just turn the entire place into a permanent pride parade. No, my preoccupations probably as a writer are less to do with physical structures and preserving them just simply for the sake of preserving them. I guess I'm more interested in excavation and unearthing. So if we see a building, I mean, how are we even supposed to know it's significant unless we know the stories behind it? And when we talk about history, in every city, there is always a certain account of history that's always privileged, and it's usually a male account, and it's usually a male account of a certain class and positioning as well. But there's all these parallel histories running alongside it that are just as legitimate and important to tell. There's women's history, there's black history, there's queer history, there's Asian Australian history. There's all types of different stories that are just as significant to all these different communities as well. And I guess taking it back to the personal as well, I mean, I'm the child of Asian migrants, Chinese migrants who came out of Hong Kong at a time where a lot of people were moving out of Hong Kong in the late 70s and throughout the 80s as well. But there have been different influxes of migration into Australia, but I didn't necessarily know about them until I talked to Chinese Australian people of a different generation who had the most ochre accents in far north Queensland. And if you go to, say, a performance or an exhibition of William Yang's, for instance, and he guides you through all these stories, and that's the structure where this happened to my family when they arrived at this time. It's suddenly imbued with importance. You know, it might be a hideous structure, it might be the most ghastly architectural abomination, but if we know the stories behind it, I think that's a far more interesting approach, at least for me.
Well, that's a terrific point to both thank our panel, who we'll be hearing more from, and to turn to you as the audience. And I'm sure that there are a whole range of people and specialists here. And again, because we are recording this, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself in whatever way you'd like to identify yourself. And just keep an eye on our two. And I did actually see there was somebody, there are lots and lots of questions. And there was one just here.
Panel and not moderating it in this room.
And we're just going to start with this woman down the front here.
Thank you. Ruth Woods is my name. I'm an architect. I also own a heritage building that I live in, and I do work in heritage in my profession. I would like to ask the panel, who is responsible for the intangible heritage, for recording the stories? Who is responsible in this state for assisting with the preservation of the heritage, for the bricks and mortar? Because that's a very big question for heritage, and it doesn't have the profile. And I guess I'm asking that in light of the fact that Queensland is the only state in Australia that doesn't have grants for any of these things to assist people to do the stories, to preserve the bricks and mortar. I'm just interested in opinions on that.
So did you say tangible or intangible?
Well, you've got both. Intangible is the stories, and then you've got the tangible, the bricks and mortar.
Well, I would say, from my end of things, ABC Local Radio should play, and I think does play a large part in the intangible side of things. Stories, collating stories, and holding them together and bringing them back and bringing people around that kind of the half that is the radio. I think the ABC Radio has a role there. I certainly, when I was doing an afternoon show just for Brisbane, I certainly saw that as part of my role.
And especially, Richard, with that Cloudland special that you guys did a few years ago. My partner's one of Richard's colleagues as well, and I remember that was just this amazing interface of stories and photographs of a structure that was demolished very, very quickly in Queensland's history. But the outpouring of stories for that, online and on the airwaves, was quite staggering.
Yes, we're not too good at dealing with success in the ABC. When something's very successful, we kind of got deluged by that, actually, as it turned out. A lot of photos from those photo booths that used to be in Cloudland. Older people, and probably people here tonight, who went to Cloudland, kissed their first girl or boy and took a photo in those photo booths there with those amazing backgrounds. And people showed up with those and gave them to us, and we put them on an online resource on our abc.net.au/Brisbane website.
And also the library itself is also quite active in collecting both oral histories and stories, and obviously the document-based heritage as well. Although I think some of the answer to your question is probably a sort of formal one that we can't necessarily answer because it's part of the sort of legislative system. But I think, Dale, as a member of the library board, you might have a particular answer.
I think the library plays an enormous role in collecting the stories. I mean, almost to the point where there are more than we can manage. And one of my apprehensions is how many digital stories are being generated at the moment that we don't store. There is the legal deposit that every book that's ever published goes to the library, but digital's been around for about 20 years and we have no such systematic collection of digital. And I worry about that enormously, that there are stories that are going to be lost. But there's also, particularly, and I think we're a bit remiss tonight in that this has been an all-white panel and that we've talked about all-white heritage and that we're well, close enough.
I'm white on the
Australian accent, you could pass, let me tell you. I think that we do have to consider that when I speak of a lost heritage, it's almost minimal in comparison to the Indigenous lost heritage. And one of the things the library is doing with the Indigenous Knowledge Centres is helping all over North Queensland to gather the stories and the digital stories and the videos of the sacred places and the elders talking to the children to actually promote that heritage. But there's also, just down the road here in Fortitude Valley, there's a small company of 3 25-year-old males who have got the second most successful app in existence. And when I ask them how much money they had in the bank, it's like millions and millions, and their personal fortunes are millions and millions. And they're going to get lost, because that's not going to become part of our heritage, because we don't have any of their records or things like that. So as we move from print to digital, we're going to have a huge number of things that are going to be lost as a heritage to future generations. So the library has a pretty big role to play there, and I wish we could have legal deposit for digital. And every DVD, think of the DVDs that are made about historical things, about people who make them for their corporations and things like that. Why can't we have everybody submit one to the library?
And there's another question over here. I think this man in the blue shirt was waiting.
Thanks very much. Doug Shepherd's my name. A question generally to the panel. I guess I too despair for heritage in Queensland. Listening to the talk tonight, I was very pleased to hear the emphasis on Brisbane and the southeast corner, but that does constitute about, 5% of the state of Queensland. There have been references to other places. I've lived for many years in Rockhampton. Rockhampton is recognised as having, for instance, one of the best Georgian streetscapes along the riverbank. It's slowly mouldering away. What really is the future of heritage if we only concentrate on a very small part of it?
Well, and to be fair to the actual formal organisation, I think we have talked about that corner, but and I think some of the examples from the images there did go up to the north part of Queensland, but absolutely it's such an important part of how we imagine the state, and it's a very complex history, which I think Kathleen in particular was talking about. And
certainly, Doug, so many of those regional towns, when you get a boom, when you get a lot of development and a rush to development and a rush to look more, the towns to look flasher, you lose so much of that heritage, and it's got to come down to the people who live in these places. You've got to get militant, and I really mean the word militant. If your government's not doing it and your council's not doing it, you've got to shout really loud. Because no one's going to do it for you in Queensland. They really aren't.
It sounds like Innisfail, which is so beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
Innisfail's a beautiful, beautiful town. And Mackay, I haven't been to Mackay for about 20 years, unfortunately, but I adored Mackay when I used to go there quite a bit. But I don't know what it's like now. I know that the mining boom has distorted that local economy enormously and changed the housing market there. And when you have a housing market boom, that kind of ruins everything in a town in a lot of ways. It's done a lot to damage Sydney too, I think. Towns like Innisfail, I was in Innisfail a year after Cyclone Larry, and the whole place looked like it had sort of been put through the wash. All the colours had sort of been bleached off the place. And I've been told now from people who have family connections with it that those old Italian families that Kathleen was talking about there, of course, they've had kids, they've become more Australianised, they've moved out of town. And that's true for places like Texas, on the Queensland-New South Wales border as well, which once had that great thriving Italian tobacco culture there. That's slowly sort of slipping away, and it'll be like it never existed maybe 20, 30, 40 years from now. And the thought of that just kills me, to be honest, that's going to be lost. I hope it isn't lost. I really hope it's not lost. Well, I don't know what's been done to preserve it, to be honest.
Well, and the difficult histories that we've been talking about too, a lot of them are embodied in the sense of what the North was, the idea that you couldn't send white women there and that white men couldn't work there, which was part of the thinking behind the bills to get Pacific Island labourers in here too. Not to mention the relationship to Asia and to the Torres Strait and the pearl luggers and so on. I mean, it's a fantastically exciting history. But there's a question here, and I know there's at least one up the back and another one over here, I believe. But sorry, this woman here's next.
My name is Elizabeth Handley. I'm from Brisbane Residents United. I just wanted to ask the question, looking at a lot of the material that we've had at the back there, the last time that there was as grave a threat to heritage in Queensland was the Bjelke-Petersen era. We are about to lose most of the legislation that has come in to protect our heritage and to insist that there was community views into development around Queensland, and that is being threatened by the proposed legislation that's been put in by Campbell Newman's government. I just wondered what the panel has to say about the proposed legislation and the effect that they can see that legislation having on heritage. And that's right throughout Queensland, because they're also looking at changing local government acts as well.
A reminder of just how political the past always is. And of course, working with the ABC, I don't have any opinions on that, so I'll let the rest of you comment.
I know that there has the 6 members on the council have been asked to reapply for their positions again, which sounds interesting to say the least. And governments are known to stack committees with their own sort of people. I think the changes are going to be really quite far-reaching, and I think people need to watch it really carefully, or we're going to end up going into that sort of era again. I mean, at the moment, a lot of organisations are being told there is no money for that because of cost cutting. But, when those sort of restrictions come to an end, when you can't blame the budget anymore, well, you're going to have to question, is money not put into certain things because of ideological reasons?
Very delicate position, being a recipient of government funding. I think, Louise, I better pass on this particular comment, because what I might say might not be diplomatic. I just think it's so easy to destroy and so difficult to reconstruct and to build in so many circumstances. And the things that you want to fight for is preservation, is respect for the past, etc. And I deplore any measure that goes against that, personally.
Well, I'm a freelancer, which is a fancy way of saying that I'm self-employed, which is a fancy way of saying I'm unemployed, which puts me in a completely non-delicate position to talk about this. I mean, I'm not too completely up on the Act or what the changes that are being proposed necessarily, but I was a part of the committee to install the Queensland Literary Awards that was in response to the dismantling of the Queensland Premier's Awards that were taken away as one of the first acts of government when they started work. And on one level, that's an affront to writers, and you could argue that that's a very sort of financial consideration. But on another level, you could argue that in one swift movement, a lot of awards, some of which have existed for decades, were completely wiped off the slate very, very quickly without much consultation with not just the writing community, but the different communities that those awards set out to represent. The black writing community, I'm thinking particularly with the David Uniapan Award, for instance. So it's a trigger-happy government that we've got at the moment. It'd be interesting to see what happens next.
Can I I can see problems in some ways. I just putting what this new government's doing to one side for a moment, and talking in much more general terms. Continuous public input can lead to a situation, though, where everything's stalemated, and where there is vision, it's never able to be enacted, and what you end up with is kind of the same thing happening. You end up with the kind of bland stuff we have in Brisbane CBD right now, because you end up with inoffensive architecture everywhere. So there are problems with this whole idea that the public are always right, because I'm not sure they always are about some things, because sometimes it takes a bit of vision and people get used to it and adjust to something new, because we don't always really know what we like until we actually have it. So let me just add that little thought there.
And there's another question waiting over here, and I'm sure we're not going to get to all of the questions that you're busting to ask, but we'll do our very best.
So I'm so glad I came tonight. I've enjoyed very much what the panel have had to say about heritage and what's happened to Brisbane. I have so much affinity with what has been said. I'm 69. John Gibson's my name. I live in Kenmore. I retired in 2008 after a 46-year career as a consulting engineer in Brisbane. I met my wife at Cloudland in 1962. I was born in 1943 at the Royal Brisbane Hospital in the old brick building, and my wife was born there too in 1942. I've had recent experiences where I've been trying to change things, to put things right. When I first commenced my engineering career, I was understudy to a man called Jack McWilliam. He was the first consulting engineer in Brisbane. He was the first consulting engineer in 1924 when the legislation was changed then to allow people to become consulting engineers on their own. Up until that time, he was a registered architect and an engineer as well. And he was the first engineer in 1924, consulting engineer in Queensland. In that year, he started the design of the Brisbane City Hall. That's a steel frame building in beside that Hellerton sandstone all around the sides. It's a magnificent building. It's steel framed right throughout, concrete encased. I was his understudy in the 1960s. I worked with him. He designed a lot of the older buildings in Brisbane. MacArthur Chambers, the old Westpac Bank on the corner of George Street and the Mall. Several other buildings in steel framed in the Queen Street, and in particular, he designed the old Winter Garden Theatre. Now, those of you who are old enough might remember the Winter Garden Theatre. It was not quite as good as the Regent, but it was a picture theatre built in 1928 when moving pictures and sound was all coming together, and we had those sort of things as our way of life. And I took Jack McWilliam onto the site of the Winter Garden Theatre when it was being redeveloped into the Winter Garden Stage 1 shopping centre. And right beside that was the old Her Majesty's Theatre. And that Her Majesty's Theatre, when it was demolished, a lot of people thought, that was a loss to Brisbane's heritage. But in fact, in 1928, that theatre was changed from a three-level... it was an opera theatre, three-level, with the circular columns in the horseshoe shape. And I've got some of the copies of the old drawings of 1878 and copies of it being built. So when that building was demolished, it had been changed in 1928 to a two-level theatre where you could watch films and you could watch stage plays. And I went there very early when I saw my first stage play, Oklahoma, was playing there. I did a complete structural investigation of the old Her Majesty's Theatre, and I deemed it was a cut and it was very much, in 1928, destroyed as a theatre which was, originally started life as an opera house. It was a very elegant building. I'm getting a little bit off the track, but in 1987, I designed the Winter Garden Stage 1 shopping centre. It was designed by Robin Gibson, same name as me, but no relation. We're probably the lesser monetary endowed side of Mel Gibson's family. But anyway, he's had a few family problems of his own, so he's not so famous anymore with me. Anyway, Rob Gibson designed that Winter Garden Stage 1. He also designed all these cultural centres. Now, I worked on the cultural centre buildings, and I worked on a lot of other Brisbane high-rise buildings. I once worked for Christopher Skase on the Sheraton Mirage Gold Coast Resort. Even the vanquished and now deceased had their good points. And all he wanted to do in those years was build the best resorts in Queensland. In 1988, the Sheraton Mirage was, in fact, the best resort and best hotel in Australia. I know what has changed here over a long period of time, going back to my knowledge of the City Hall, to my knowledge of the older buildings. I've restored a lot of buildings that I helped design. The old T&G building on the corner of the Mall in Albert Street, I worked on that. That was a very advanced structural engineering design building. Was the same principles as the Gateway Bridge, as the Victoria Bridge, as the Captain Cook Bridge. Segmental, precast, post-tension design. And that was done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gibson. I think there's a few other questions.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to say that I've a lot to share, and I've got a lot of affinity with what Richard has said, because I heard of his interview with Captain Richard de Crespigny of Qantas fame, and I'd like very much to talk to Richard after the meeting. Thank you.
And thank you for the reminder of how complicated the stories are involving the design, the work, that there are so many histories that we have. I suspect we only have time for one more quick comment or question.
Hi, my name's Nicole. Look, I've Brisbane girl, born and raised, recently had just come back from living 3 years in Melbourne, and I suppose it might be more of a comment as well as a question, but do you think people in Brisbane or even Queensland are as passionate about preserving culture as opposed to maybe in Melbourne, where this might be more snobby, but there seems to be a real excitement for their past and maybe an over-exuberance for it. But, you know, things like Open House in Melbourne have been going on for so many years, and people my age are really passionate about it compared to, say, Open House in Brisbane, which was, people are really fond of, but nobody in my age group was particularly interested in. What does the panel think about that?
Look, I think certainly in Melbourne there's been some really exciting collaborations as far as heritage goes. I mean, you say the word heritage and history, it's just so boring, it dies in the water, doesn't it? It's just so dusty. So you've got to do some really interesting collaborations and really unlikely pairings. And I know in places like Melbourne they've done things like they'll take an old building or an old collection like the Mr. Johnston collection, who was a collector who's got an amazing house full of amazing furniture and things. And they, instead of just having it preserved, you can go and visit it, that's all very nice. I mean, once you've seen a house like that once, you don't want to see it again. But they've done things like they allowed the designer, Akira, to have access to, the fashion designer, Akira, to have access to that collection. And so you can't just rock up there, you've got to get on a special tour and you're taken there because you don't know the address. And it's called Akira Meets Mr. Johnston. And he takes that collection, he can do whatever he likes with it for, say, 3 months. So you can go through the different rooms and they're different every time you go through them. So you're getting an audience of 20 and 30-year-olds who love his fashion, who are being exposed to heritage. And I can't understand why we don't do things like in Brisbane, like Sass and Bide meets Newstead House. Or Easton and Pearson meets Newstead House. I mean, bringing new audiences to heritage sites and buildings and stories is the future, because if you can't get a 20-year-old involved or excited or feel a certain way about their city, I mean, in 20 years' time, they're the custodians.
I think that's actually quite a powerful point to end on, and so I'd like you all to please thank our lively and intelligent panel. And I should also say, though, that before you go, we'd just like briefly to welcome to the stage Glenda Sheaf from the Queensland Heritage Council.
Well, good evening. My name's Glenda Sheaf and I'm a member of the Queensland Heritage Council. Firstly, I'd like to thank each one of our panellists this evening and Dr. Kate Evans for providing us with a fascinating, quite provocative look at heritage tonight. And also, I'd like to thank the people who organised this wonderful group of photos. I'm sure you've all enjoyed them as much as I have while we've been listening to you. I think we'll all leave here with a different perspective on what heritage means to us, including all those wonderful personal, social stories, the oral histories, all those facets of life that, they may seem seemingly ordinary in themselves, but they create a feeling of passion, curiosity, wonderful memories, but often with a sense of sadness, of loss, and a sense of change that is somehow inevitable. Maybe a sense of hopelessness sometimes. But we have seen that heritage, in inverted commas, is a very broad topic. And I think there are opportunities. I'd like to be hopeful that there are definite opportunities that we can commemorate and keep our heritage alive. But I think you've shown us tonight that it is up to every one of us as individuals, we can't rely on somebody else. It's like they need to do it. No, we need to do it. I need to do it. Each one of us needs to become very actively involved so that we can commemorate, we can conserve and preserve both our tangible and intangible parts of our heritage. All our heritage collectively is extremely important. So on behalf of the Heritage Council, I'd like to present each member of the panel with a model of a Queensland house as a token of our appreciation for your outstanding input into tonight and your obvious love of heritage. And I also have another wonderful, one of these marvellous little houses, which I'd like to present to a lucky winner of our door prize tonight. You may have noticed that people were asked to put business cards in. So if you were one of the good people who did as you were told, and this one is McQueenie, Jock McQueenie. Is Jock there? Come on down. You now have one of these marvellous ones as well. So congratulations. And as has been mentioned earlier this evening, we have recorded tonight's discussion and it will be available on the State Library's webcasts page if you'd like to listen to it again. There'll also be a transcript available for download in the next week or so. And we would appreciate your feedback on tonight's discussion and invite you to please fill out the event survey as you leave. If you've enjoyed tonight, you may also be interested in attending another free event being held in the State Library shop on Monday the 29th of October at 6 p.m. David Hill will be discussing his latest book, The Great Race, which chronicles the race between the Frenchman Nicolas Boudin and the Englishman Matthew Flinders to chart the map of Australia. Details are available at the State Library website. And lastly, you're all invited to attend the final Out of the Port lunchtime talk for this year, and they're off, A History of Queensland Horse Racing, which is being held on Wednesday the 7th of November at 12:30 p.m. in the State Library's Auditorium 2. So thank you again for coming along tonight. I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I have and wish you a safe trip home.